Hey, Darren, should we get started?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're excited to host this webinar on state clean heat standards. When I formed the Alliance for Green Heat 14 years ago, there's no talk of clean heat standards. It was only renewable electricity standards. So we've been waiting a long time for our moment in the sun, which we is really starting now. And I think we have two states that have clean heat standards. And we're going to hear from speakers in both those states. Vermont, well, Massachusetts is in the making. I shouldn't say we have two, we have one, but there are many other states that are considering it. And I hope some of the states that some of our viewers are from are also considering it and can learn something from this webinar. There's a lot of overlap with clean electricity standards, but there's some real differences too. And we are really lucky today to have Jared Duval, who participated intensively in the Vermont Clean Heat Standard, along with Chris Egan, who's now working in his state, Lilith Guzman, who's on our staff and has a lot of equity education background, passion. So with that, I will turn it over to our moderator, Darian Dyer, who's also on our staff.
Yep. So just some basic things to go over before we jump into it here. We'll be using the Q&A function. There's no chat. And as we go along to each speaker, go ahead and throw your questions into the Q&A function and we'll answer them towards the end. There's no reason to worry about any kind of mics or cameras. We're totally in the webinar sphere. So that is about it. I'm going to launch our first poll just to kind of get us started. Let's see here. A basic one, and I'll give it a few seconds for everyone to answer this real quick. We'll have about 5 of these throughout. I'll just pop them up every once in a while. As they're coming in, it looks like a lot from industry. State employee is running second. We've got a few interesting others. A few more seconds. Got about 90% participation. And I'll go ahead and end it here. This is who you're all listening in with. That's a nice little picture of everyone. And all right, I'm going to hand it over to Jared, and he can start us off.
Thank you, Darian, and thank you, John and Lilith and Chris. Really glad to be with you all this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me just make sure that this is working. Okay, great. So good morning, everybody. By way of introduction, my name is Jared Duval. I'm joining you from Montpelier, Vermont, where I serve as executive director of a nonprofit organization called Energy Action Network. We do research analysis for the state of Vermont and for a broad and diverse network of members who are working together to meet Vermont's renewable energy and climate commitments. Back in 2020, I was appointed to Vermont's Climate Council and helped co-author Vermont's first climate action plan, the #1 emissions reducing recommendation of which was the establishment of a clean heat standard. I just want to make clear that in talking about the clean heat standard today and really any kind of policy positions that might emerge, I'm doing so solely in my role as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, which required me to be part of making policy recommendations, including on a clean heat standard. But though that I am not representing my organization, EAN, which does not take positions on public policy issues or engage in any lobbying. So this is a presentation today just in my role as a member of the Climate Council. However, I would say that there is a lot of helpful information and resources that the Energy Action Network produces that folks may be interested in, and that's available at eanvt.org. And you'll see some of those resources in the slides I'm going to share. So to start with some context, I think that many of us likely follow the climate science. We know what the international commitments are through the IPCC process, the Paris Accord. And when there are, both as a country, the United States has made a commitment to do our part towards those science-based targets to avoid the worst consequences of a destabilized climate. And a number of states have said that they're going to do their part towards the United States target. A number of them have joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, for instance. And so this is a graph that shows kind of where some different states, at least in the Northeast, I apologize to those who are elsewhere, but we can kind of see, given the latest data that we have to compare across, this is really the Northeast, the progress towards that Paris commitment. And in my home state of Vermont, we clearly have a lot to do. We've made the least progress in terms of getting to that minimum 26% reduction in climate pollution or in greenhouse gas emissions below 2005 levels by 2025, the least progress of any state in the Northeast towards that target so far. And so when we look at our emissions, this is just one state. Every state view is going to be different. This is the view in Vermont, that right now in 2020, you see this middle bar here, our largest source of greenhouse gas pollution in our state is emissions from residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use, otherwise known as the thermal sector. It was actually recently that it was the first time that sector surpassed our transportation sector. But together, nearly 3/4 of Vermont's climate pollution comes from how we get around and how we heat our homes and buildings. And so policy solutions aimed at those sectors in particular are really important, and that's where a clean heat standard comes in. The one key element of a clean heat standard is that it is a performance standard, which establishes a certain amount of clean heat activity, emissions reducing activity that has to take place by certain dates. And that allows it to align with either the goals that certain states have set or the legal obligations that some states are under if they have passed a Global Warming Solutions Act or its equivalent. So here in Vermont, we are legally required to reduce our emissions at least 40% by 2030, 40% below 1990 levels. There's also in our Global Warming Solutions Act a very strong equity focus, wanting to make sure that the energy transition is not just one that reduces climate pollution, but that saves folks money and builds a more equitable energy economy than the very inequitable fossil fuel economy that we have right now. We know that this sector is particularly challenging, especially in a state like Vermont, many other New England states where the housing stock is older. In many places, the turnover rate of heating equipment is slow, and those changes require thousands and thousands, millions of decisions from individual households and business owners. It's not the type of thing where a regulation can be applied on utility companies and you're focusing on a small handful of decision makers. This is a situation where we need to provide incentives and help and assistance for folks to move to more efficient, cleaner heat, both for purposes of the climate and for a more equitable energy economy where heat costs less. We know that, many different states are different. Apologies again, this is just a Northeast view. In terms of how homes are heated. Up here in northern New England, there's a really high reliance on delivered fossil fuels like fuel oil and propane, whereas in more southern New England and many other parts of the country, there's much more use of fossil gas. And that's a challenge and an opportunity, because those fuels, especially fuel oil and propane, are higher polluting in terms of their carbon intensity and more expensive. And so the more that we can do to move away from them, it can be a real win-win for reducing climate pollution and reducing heating costs. Many folks on this call will know about the volatility of the commodity global fossil fuel market. You see the gray, the pink, the purple lines there. Those are propane, kerosene, and fuel oil. Some of, not just on average, the highest cost ways to heat space or water, but also some of the most price volatile. And you'll note on the bottom there, you see those lines for wood pellets and wood chips, which tend to be on average much lower cost and much more price stable. So a big part of what Vermont was thinking about with the Clean Heat Standard is how can we help Vermonters get off an expensive fossil fuel roller coaster to lower cost, more price stable heating options. So I'm just going to briefly say what the Affordable Heat Act is, which established Vermont's Clean Heat Standard, and how it works, and then talk a little bit very specifically about equity and the role of wood heat. Again, it's a performance standard, as John said, similar to renewable portfolio standards that have existed in the electricity sector. There have been energy efficiency performance standards, a real source of information and kind of a blueprint for some of the key design elements of the Clean Heat Standard came from the Clean Fuel Standards that have been established for the transportation sectors out in Oregon, Washington, and California. You can get a sense of how widespread and tried and true the performance standard model is. And as John said, Vermont and Colorado are in the process of establishing them. It is pointed to in the Massachusetts Climate Plan. And just last month, in a press release from the U.S. Climate Alliance, an additional 8 states beyond those first 3 I mentioned have announced they are exploring developing a clean heat standard of their own. And you can see that list at the bottom there. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the architecture of the Clean Heat Standard and at least how it's worked in Vermont. There's certainly different design choices that could be applied elsewhere. So let's start. The focus is an obligation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the obligated parties are the importers of fossil heating fuels into the state. So that means gas utilities. And it also means delivered fuel importers. Here in Vermont, that's a lot of fuel oil and propane. And the way that you comply is earning clean heat credits that represent actual emissions reduction in the state by delivering clean heat solutions to households and businesses to help them transition to cleaner and more efficient heat. There are many, many things that can earn clean heat credits in the policy design that we've established: weatherization, heat pump water heaters, and crucially for this conversation, advanced wood heat. But there's a list of, I think, 12 or 13, and there are likely more eligible clean heat measures that will be established as the research continues by Vermont's Public Utility Commission. So I just spoke about what some of these are. There's a real rationale here of wanting to have many possible ways to reduce emissions and meet customers and households and businesses where they are, provide consumer choice, and enable many people to participate in the emerging clean heat market for kind of market and business development reasons. So, if the thermal sector is going to carry its weight, do its part towards meeting emissions reduction requirements, there is a lot of market development, a lot of clean heat activity that's going to happen across the board. No single solution but weatherization, heat pumps, advanced wood heat will all likely need to play a role. This is just one example pathway from modeling in Vermont. There could be others, and there will likely be a role for some other solutions as well. We have to see how that market develops and what the obligated parties choose to do to meet their obligation to reduce climate pollution. Really importantly, at the very outset, the Climate Council and the Vermont legislature wanted to make sure that as we work to transform Vermont's heating sector into a more a cleaner and more efficient one, that it also contributed to a more equitable energy economy, recognizing that lower and moderate income households have much higher energy burdens, or the share of income that they're spending on heat, and that we wanted to make sure that a progressive share, the amount of clean heat activity and benefits going to lower and moderate income households, that the number of those households was served was greater than their share of the population. So a progressive rather than regressive approach to the clean heat transition from an income perspective. There's also a requirement that the clean heat services delivered to low and moderate incomes households, at least half of those have to be long-lived measures that lower bills over the long term, including weatherization, heat pump installations, advanced wood heat installations. And there will also be an equity advisory group that looks at other ways to ensure that equity is centered and advanced in the implementation of the clean heat standard. This is just a graph that shows while the clean heat credits will be able to come from the residential, commercial, and industrial sector, there's a requirement that 32% of all clean heat activity has to come from serving low or lower moderate income households. But since the residential market is only about half of our total thermal fuel sector, if the clean heat standard is complied with kind of in proportion as to the fuel use, then it's likely that about 60% of all residential clean heat activity via the clean heat standard will come from serving low or moderate income households. So switching more to the wood heat side of things, the key feature in terms of how success is measured in a clean heat standard beyond the equity side on the emissions side is based in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reduction. It is, the bill points to, the statute points to building on the GREET model, the Greenhouse Gas Regulated Emissions and Energy Use and Technologies model developed by Argonne National Labs. That was initially energy use in transportation. It's more recently updated to technologies. So there will be additional work for Vermont and other states that are applying a clean heat standard to the thermal sector to characterize some of the measures in the thermal sector that have not been analyzed on a life cycle basis by Argonne National Labs or another state. There will need to be life cycle analysis that assesses the fuel pathways of different types of wood heat in order to comply with the life cycle analysis requirements in the clean heat standard. And I think that it's likely that different types of wood heat are going to score very differently. I think that it is likely that locally, sustainably sourced cordwood or pellets from sustainably managed forests that aren't coming here from afar, don't have a big carbon footprint in terms of their production or their transportation, those are likely to score really well. I would not be surprised if somebody's trying to comply with a clean heat standard with pellets that are produced in an unsustainable way from far away that have a big carbon footprint, either in terms of their production or in their transportation, would score really poorly and perhaps may not be eligible or only eligible for a very small amount of clean heat credits. Again, clean heat credits are only earned in proportion to the amount of life cycle emissions reduction that can be independently assessed in the peer-reviewed scientific process that will be overseen by a technical advisory group appointed by our Public Utility Commission.
Jared, just hopping in here to give you the 15-minute mark.
Thanks, Darian. So I'm about to finish up, but I just want to highlight a couple of key terms that may be useful outside of Vermont. Actually, this definition of fuel pathway is not from Vermont. We borrowed this directly from Oregon, from their clean fuel standard. But this is a really key definition in terms of thinking through the questions about how different types of wood heat may be assessed under a clean heat standard. It's not going to be a one size fits all. It's really going to matter where it comes from, how it was produced, and the life cycle emissions involved in that. And that's likely to be different between cordwood, wood chips, wood pellets, certainly wood pellets produced in different ways or in different locations. Advanced wood heating is explicitly named in Vermont's Affordable Heat Act as an eligible measure for the clean heat standard. That term is not defined in the statute, however, and so it will need to be further developed by our Public Utility Commission. I think generally what that refers to is what all of you know as advanced wood heating, which is, refers to the efficiency and the sustainability, both in terms of the equipment and in terms of the sourcing and harvesting. But that will need to be further developed. This is an example from Oregon about, they have over 220 different fuel pathways that are assessed in their carbon intensity. And, some biodiesels score well, some score poorly. It depends on the sourcing and production method and what those life cycle assessments end up showing. And I think something similar will be likely in terms of some distinction between different forms of wood heat, but that's an open question. We have to see how that develops here in Vermont and elsewhere. So just to wrap up, why a clean heat standard was developed here, it was that we saw a necessity for a policy driver to help Vermonters and hopefully people elsewhere get off of the high cost, price volatile fossil fuel roller coaster so that we can save billions of dollars on heating bills. And we also know that the thermal sector is here in Vermont the highest polluting, and in many other places a high polluting sector that needs to be part of the climate solution, moving towards more efficient and clean options. This policy option was a way to build in equity from the outset in terms of identifying the people that need to be served, in Vermont's case, lower and middle income folks, with the clean heat services that the fossil fuel importers either need to deliver directly or cause to be delivered by providing incentives to other folks doing that work. If anyone wants additional information, there is the link there to the Act 18 of 2023, the passed Affordable Heat Act. There was also a frequently asked questions resource that Energy Action Network developed at the request of legislators. You can find that at that second link. And for anybody who wants to follow along with the proceedings of the rulemaking and investigations related to the clean heat standard in Vermont, that can be done through our Public Utility Commission, and those are the rule and investigation numbers. So I'm going to end there.
Perfect timing. That allows us to throw up another one of our polls before we get to Chris. Let me launch it here. This one is on location, and these are not perfect regions. However you identify is the best way to do it, just so we can kind of get a snapshot of where we're all coming into. Of course, the Northeast is showing up very well. But we have some representation in the West, the Midwest, a little bit in the Southeast. Hoping to have someone from the Southwest chime in. Maybe someone from Alaska. I'll give it a few seconds. Alrighty, I think we've got most people answering. Northeast, as always, showing up. There you go. Great to see where everyone is. That's awesome. All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Chris.
Great, thank you very much. Just Share my screen here. Okay. Thanks very much. My name is Chris Egan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Forest Alliance, and we're an organization that represents forest landowners, foresters, timber harvesters, and forest products companies in Massachusetts. So obviously we have an interest in wood heat. So very quickly, in 15 minutes, I'm going to try to cram this in. Talk a little bit about modern wood heat, because there was a question about that, some of the decarbonization, air quality impacts, some of the regulatory history. We have an existing renewable heating program called the APS, and then move into the development of the CHS here in Massachusetts. So someone asked about the definition of advanced wood heat, which Jared mentioned. We call it modern wood heat. You'll also hear it called automated wood heat. So here in Massachusetts, it doesn't include things like fireplaces or wood stoves, outdoor wood boilers. It doesn't include pellet stoves. It looks like pellet stoves might be included in Vermont's clean heat standard going forward. That's unclear, but pellet stoves aren't part of the APS, our current clean heating program, renewable heating program in Massachusetts. So what is included are these whole building, essentially furnace boiler replacements, and they run on pellets or chips. Here's what they look like. Most people have never seen these, don't know anything about them. So on the left is a double pellet system, on the right is a chip system. And they're very advanced. They're high efficiency. You see here, those efficiencies are the minimum to get into the APS in Massachusetts. And they're automated, so the fuel is fed automatically. There's nothing you need to do. It's not like loading wood into a wood stove. You just turn the thermostat. And there's more than 200 of these in Massachusetts, and the majority are in single-family homes. So what we see is people switching from oil to wood. So they switch from an oil boiler to a pellet boiler. Here's some economic stats from 2021. You can see, because the fuel is produced locally, manufactured locally, consumed locally, all that money stays in the local economy, so it has a ripple effect, much different than oil or gas, which are coming from far away or potentially even overseas. So let's talk about the carbon impact of modern wood heat. So what we hear from opponents of this is they try to intentionally confuse people by trying to make them think that biomass power, like a giant biomass power plant, is the same thing as a pellet boiler, right? So obviously there's a huge difference between a 40 megawatt power plant and a pellet boiler in someone's basement. And most people, like we said, most people don't understand that most of these are in single family homes. I get questions from reporters about, where are all the massive heating plants? And I was like, well, do you consider a pellet boiler in your neighbor's basement a heating plant? It just really just isn't the case. So there's been a bunch of studies about the carbon impact of wood. The state did this Manomet study, which was really looking at biomass power fairly negatively. But what most people miss is, in that study, the thermal use of wood was highly regarded and showed a significant decarbonization impact. And there's been a peer-reviewed study in the journal Energy that further showed, basically an immediate 50% carbon savings if you switch to wood. And that was a thorough life cycle analysis. We sometimes get people saying, well, you haven't looked at the emissions from the harvesting equipment or the log trucks. Well, that was all included in the study. And interestingly, they found that natural gas is actually the highest carbon fossil fuel when you consider all the leaks in the pipeline, when you do that full life cycle analysis. And so we're not the only ones saying this. We're not cherry picking a handful of studies. This is from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. They're a quasi-governmental agency focused on clean energy. They have a Go Clean website, which is focused on residential energy use. And this chart may be hard to read, but it's the greenhouse gas emissions to heat a 2,000 square foot house. And this is in tons of carbon emitted per year, so per heating season. And it may be hard to read, but all the way on the left there is electric baseboard heating. This is using grid electricity, which is still mostly comes from fossil fuels. So electric baseboard heating is the most inefficient. It's really not very much used here for that reason. It's very expensive. But then you see oil, the next is propane, and then natural gas. And then over on the right in green are the three clean heating technologies: air source heat pumps. The middle one is ground source heat pumps, which a lot of people refer to as geothermal. And on the far right there is automated wood heating, what we call modern wood heat. And you can see that there's a substantial carbon savings. And like I said, most people are switching from oil. So you look at the difference between going from oil to modern wood heat, there's a significant decarbonization value there. And you can actually see that using grid electricity based on 2020 data, that it's actually less of an impact than air source heat pumps using grid electricity. Obviously that will change as our grid becomes renewable, but that will take, many years before that happens. The other issue that people point to is air pollution. So let's look at some stats. A wood stove from the 1980s produced about 4.5 pounds of PM 2.5, which is very small particles per million BTUs of heat generated. One of these new pellet boilers is 0.03 pounds per million BTUs. That's more than 99% less. And the state actually commissioned UMass Amherst to do an air sampling study of schools in rural Massachusetts that had switched from oil boilers to pellet boilers for their heat. And what they found is when they made that switch, their air quality improved. It didn't get worse. And the emissions were less toxic to human health as well. So there's extensive research on that shows that including one study that followed 400,000 Americans for 15 years, full access to the health records, tied that into detailed air sampling data from where they lived, and looked at the differences. So what most people don't get is that PM 2.5 is not a thing, it's a size descriptor. So like oil PM 2.5 is very different than wood PM 2.5. And the studies show that wood is less harmful. And then on top of this, you can add an emissions control device like an ESP, and that can remove 99% of the particulates. So it's fairly expensive to do. It's about 10% of the installed cost of the system. So we have a bill before the legislature this session that would incentivize this, that installation to make it more economically feasible. So I mentioned we have this existing program called the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, or the APS. It's overseen by DOER in Massachusetts. It was created as an offshoot of the RPS, which is renewable power. And the focus initially was on natural gas CHP, combined heat and power. So it was designed to incentivize people who are making power using natural gas, not utilities, but there are folks like colleges with their own little power plants, and hospitals. Increasingly in Massachusetts, we see life science research companies with labs that are doing this, and some business campuses. And so they would get credit. They would burning natural gas to make high pressure steam. They would run that through a turbine to make power. What comes out the other end is low pressure steam. If you could put that into a building now for steam heat, now you have you're essentially using that heat, which otherwise would be wasted. So instead of burning natural gas twice to create power and heat, you're only doing it once. You might say, why do they make this whole new standard? Well, it's because natural gas isn't a renewable, doesn't fit in the RPS. It's not renewable, but it is a decarbonizer if you're able to use it to offset additional gas use. So a lot of us said, well, wait a minute, you should have this should extend to renewable heating in homes and businesses, thermal only technologies. So we worked with environmental organizations in this coalition to add those systems to the APS, and we were successful. So we added air and ground source heat pumps and modern wood heat to the APS. And the treatment is a little bit different. Ground source heat pumps get a 5x credit multiplier. That means for every alternative energy credit they earn, they get 5 actual credits. Air source gets a 3x multiplier, and wood heat doesn't get any. Heat pumps also get another advantage in that they're pre-minted. So it means they get the life, all the credits up front for the life of the system. So, the life of an air source heat pump system is 10 to 15 years. You would get all the credits you would earn over those years up front. And that's helpful because it can help defer the cost of installation, which is, tends to be more than a fossil fuel heating system. Modern wood heat's different. You earn them over time, every time you purchase pellets or chips. We heard Jared talk about obligated parties in the Clean Heat Standard. APS obligated parties are the electric utilities because this stemmed off of the RPS. So they have to buy these credits or make alternative compliance payments. If you're a modern wood heat user, you have a pellet boiler in your basement and you're in the APS, you would not try to sell the credits yourself. You would give them to an aggregator who would take them from lots of people and sell them. They would keep a slice of the revenue and give you the rest. It's just much easier and simpler for you to do that. issue here in Massachusetts is that it was so relatively straightforward for natural gas power to use that waste steam to heat buildings that the credits overwhelmed the markets. There was a huge oversupply and the value of the credits crashed. There was some efforts to fix this by the Baker administration. They sort of punted it off to the new Healy administration, and so we're not sure exactly what's going to happen with this going forward. But there are plans to help reduce that oversupply. Now, if we move into the clean heat standard, so Massachusetts has done a lot of work on climate change mitigation. There's lots of things that have happened. There are these omnibus climate bills that have been passed the last 2 sessions. By omnibus, I mean you get a lot of different bills that are then put together in one giant bill. And there's been a lot of regulatory work done. So we had a Clean Heat Commission that met during 2022, and they issued a final report. And one of their strong recommendations was to create a clean heat standard. And then we have these clean energy and climate plans that the state is required to produce every 5 years. And they released the plan for 2025 and 2030 last December, and that charged the Department of Environmental Protection with creating a new clean heat standard. And so that's what they're working on now. You might say, well, hold on, wait a minute, didn't the legislature need to pass a bill? Well, in fact, Massachusetts, the legislature gave the administrative agencies a lot of leeway to create programs like this without going back to the legislature for additional authorization. So they didn't actually need to have a bill passed to create the clean heat standard. They could just, instruct DEP to do this. That being said, there are bills in the legislature this session that address the clean heat standard, that address heating, renewable heating in a variety of ways. So those all could pass. They could be compiled into an omnibus climate bill, and they could change to some degree what DEP is doing potentially. So we're just getting our planning started. The first stakeholder meeting was in June. There were stakeholder meetings in July and August. All stakeholder comments were due by September 1st, and DEP is now considering those. This is a little bit different than the APS. The obligated parties, as Jared said, would be these utilities, and Jared really went through most of this, so I'm not going to repeat it. But lots of people could earn credits in lots of different ways. It works the same way as the APS. You have to buy the credits, the obligated parties do, or they could earn them, and then it helps speed adoption of these technologies into the market. So we've seen some disputes among stakeholders so far in the planning process. One of those is technology. So there are some people who are firmly in the camp of electric only in the CHS. We should only allow air source and ground source heat pumps because they're sort of the perfect heat, and we don't want even things that are good decarbonizers. We don't want those, even if it makes it harder to reach our goals. And then another point of view is no. It's going to be really, really hard to reach our goals. So we need an all of the above approach. We need to include things like modern wood heat and potentially things like biofuels and renewable natural gas, which is a little bit more controversial. And so obviously we're in the latter camp here. We think that, it's crazy to tie your hands as you're trying to reach a really, really challenging goal. There's questions about measurement. Jared talked about the GREET measurement model. There's some dispute about that here. There are other models being proposed for how you'd measure it. So that's all in discussion. And then there's a question about whether you should count the electric generation emissions for heat pumps using grid electricity as you look at the CHS. There's no need to count them on a societal or statewide level because they're already being included into the power sector. But should you look at the decarbonization value and take that into account as you look at this? And we think the answer to that is yes. And then besides this, there are some other arguments for modern wood heat. We think they make sense in rural areas with, where most people are using oil. There's no natural gas pipelines. There's an issue of capacity. We're going to have to, significantly upgrade the grid, and that's a challenge, particularly in rural areas where the grid is already somewhat shaky. There's places with no three-phase power. Now the utilities are happy to upgrade those grids because they can charge it off to the ratepayer with a guaranteed profit margin. But our electric prices here are already among the highest in the nation, and that would drive them up further. And the other thing with the grid is we're going to be moving to a winter peaking system from a summer peaking system as we electrify our heat, because air source heat pumps need to work a lot harder the colder the temperatures go, and they consume more power. So you'd have sharp peaks on very cold winter days. There's been a lot of research showing that wood heat can actually help smooth those peaks. Right now, we turn on peaker plants that are often fueled with oil to meet that peak demand. So this would help reduce that if we went to modern wood heat as part of our clean heat standard. And then, of course, there's the fact that these are just good supplemental heat sources. Air source heat pumps can work down to cold temperatures, but they get less efficient. They consume more electricity, so you can supplement that. And then the issue is power outages. If you have a whole house air pump heat system, you can't run that off even like a whole house natural gas generator. Even with solar panels during the winter time, it would be a real challenge. You likely would not be able to use it to run the system, as you needed. So there's a good argument for backup purposes there. Our basic takeaways are we should use an all of the above approach. Modern wood heat is a high efficiency, clean, renewable, sustainable, helps the rural economy, and it's proven to decarbonize. So we should be incentivizing it as part of the clean heat standard. And we don't want to make life harder for ourselves as we try to reach these difficult goals. So that's the extent of my presentation. My contact information is here, and I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. And before we go over to Lilith and John, I, of course, have another poll for you all. Here we go. Do you support states adopting clean heat? It's maybe is a very broad area where you can stand if you'd like. But I'll give it a few seconds. And just a reminder, at any time you can throw in any questions into the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end. Okay, a few more seconds here. We're slowly climbing up. It's looking good for clean heat standards. A little bit more. Okay. So yes is leading, and maybe, which is fair enough. Very broad, very broad. All right, Lilith, let me take it away.
Thank you, Darian. Hi, everyone. My name is Lilith Guzman. I work for Alliance for Green Heat. And today I'm going to be speaking a little bit on equity considerations regarding clean heat standards. A little bit of background about myself. As John had very briefly mentioned, I graduated from University of California, Santa Cruz with my Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Studies, and my concentration was in global environmental justice. So equity considerations in all environmental sectors is kind of my bread and butter. But first, let's discuss what equity is. So in the context of the climate crisis, equity refers to the fair distribution of the burdens and benefits addressing climate change. But regarding energy equity recognizes that disadvantaged communities have been historically marginalized and overburdened by pollution, underinvestment in clean energy infrastructure, and a lack of access to energy efficient housing and transportation. These unequal burdens faced by historically disinvested communities often stem from systemic racial and social discrimination. For example, past and current policies have disproportionately concentrated low-income households and communities of color in areas with poor housing, high poverty rates, negative health impacts, and fewer high-quality jobs. A few examples of structural factors that come into play for all of this are redlining, exclusion from financing and investment opportunities, employment discrimination, and underfunded schooling. These same patterns also have limited access, add to the limited access of efficient and healthy homes for these households. And research has found that, disproportionate energy burdens nationally, regionally, and across metropolitan areas are very focused on certain groups, including low-income households, households of color, renters, and older adults. So first, let's begin with where we're currently embedded with equity. It's really important to make note of where we are now so that we can, move forward and learn from what's going on currently. Jared had mentioned this graph and had shown this graphic a little bit earlier, so I won't get too much into it. But we currently have 30 states with renewable energy portfolio standards, 25 with energy efficiency performance standards, low carbon fuel standards in 3 states, the Colorado Clean Heat Plan, which is pipeline gas only, and the Clean Heat Standard in Vermont, which we're going to dive into a little bit more. So the Clean Heat Standard in Vermont, or the Affordable Heat Act, really focuses on affordability and accessibility and really centers equity, which is why I wanted to highlight it today. Through this act, they'll be building So the Affordable Heat Act will help Vermonters to reduce their dependence on high-cost, price volatile, and polluting fossil heating fuels. And the Act will do this by establishing a clean heat standard that will reduce the pollution over time in line with science-based pollution reduction requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act that was passed in Vermont as well. The Act focuses on equity and affordability. They want to make sure that electrification, weatherization, and efficiency for low to middle income families is really the priority. And the policy, again, this is all very repetitive, but I just want to really highlight that the policy will require that a majority of clean heat services at the residential level will go towards LMI households, and that at least half of the heating services provided will be installed, and the services will be provided for those low income households. They won't have to go out of their way to get those services. Additionally, and as Jared had mentioned, the Vermont Heat Plan focuses on a clean energy economy and life cycle emissions, which is also baked into the architecture of this program, which is really fantastic. As our former speaker, Chris, also mentioned, I'm going to be talking very quickly about the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standard and how it's really equity-centered. In every piece of information that you come across for this program, equity is sitting at the forefront, which I think is absolutely fantastic. They promise to include and involve LMI households in the program design and will require that, quote, a substantial fraction of the required clean heat services be secured through delivering of these services to customers. Additionally, the Clean Heat Standard will involve LMI communities in the program design and require that a substantial fraction of the required heat services be, again, secured and delivered to these households and to these communities. It's really what we want to pull from both the Vermont Heat Standard, the Affordable Heat Standard in Vermont, and then the Clean Heat Standard in Massachusetts, is that equity is baked into the architecture of these programs. And the first thing that we're beginning to talk about, and the first things that we're putting onto our whiteboards and onto our drawing boards when we're coming up with new initiatives on how to kind of make the grid clean, and how to make sure that everybody's moving forward within clean heat. Next, I'm going to talk about not necessarily a heating standard, but the California CARE and FARA programs. We'll start with CARE. So CARE is the California Alternative Rates of Energy program. It's for low-income customers that are enrolled. They receive 30 to 35% of a discount on their electrical bill and a 20% discount on their natural gas bill. And it's important to us that we mention this and that we make note of these programs, because again, they're another program that really has equity just baked into its architecture, and something that we can really learn from when we're moving forward with the initiatives that we want to be presenting and creating regarding clean heating standards. There's a lot of crossover for the customers that participate in CARE. So for the most part, they're usually they're enrolled in Medicaid or Medi-Cal. They are on programs such as WIC, which is the Women, Infants, and Children's program. They're on programs for EBT and SNAP. LIHEAP is also another one that there's a lot of intersection with. A lot of Indigenous peoples through Head Start income eligibility for tribes are also involved in the California CARE program and are a lot of the recipients of this program. And what I really, really like about this program too is that there's the other side of it, its counterpart, which is FARA. And FARA is the Family Electric Rate Assistance Program. So for those who don't qualify for the low income or make just above too much money, they qualify for FARA. And so families whose households' income slightly exceed the CARE allowances, they'll qualify to receive FARA discounts. And this applies an 18% discount onto their electric bill every month and really helps cut the cost. I think to really drive this point home, it's really important to remember that 1 to 5 households report having to completely forego basic needs every month, such as food or medication, in order to pay for their electric bills. And there's a lot of insecurity regarding the energy sector within low and middle income communities. As the wage gap continues to widen between more affluent communities and middle and lower class communities, it's really important to remember that even if somebody is labeled as middle class, doesn't necessarily mean that they can always meet their payments on time or that they don't need the extra support from programs such as CARE or FARA. And again, why I wanted to highlight it regarding equity and how we can kind of think about these things moving forward for clean heat standards. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how we're going to implement equity into our future programs and how we can really think about things holistically so that we're not leaving anybody behind on the transition to clean heating and clean energy. So some implementation strategies have to do with the four listed. So we're going to go over inclusivity, acknowledgement, support, and promotion. So inclusive decision making should always be at the forefront of any sit-down conversation that you're having and how you're going to reach LMI households. It's involving the diverse communities that make up these households, particularly those that are most effective in or most affected, and making sure that they have a voice in the decision-making process. And in this, you're going to be building trust with these communities as well. And so that's something that I'll talk a little bit about once we get through all of these. But trust and cost are two things that are really, really imperative when thinking about how to include LMI households and how to properly implement future initiatives. Next up is acknowledgement, just making sure that there's a fair distribution of impacts and resources regarding the climate crisis, regarding how we're going to implement clean heat standards, et cetera. And what this means is really just acknowledging that these communities, once again, are more vulnerable to climate-related disasters, and ensuring that resources, aid, and support are all allocated to these communities. Not only that, but they're also going to be not only facing the burdens of the climate crisis and are worried about how they're going to heat their homes, but they're also facing issues of historic injustices, such as redlining, systemic racism, et cetera. And so that can be a lot for specific communities to take on, and it's up to the people, pursuing and initiating these initiatives, that they are not negating any of those things, and that those are conversations that are being had within the implementation of these projects as well. Once this bleeds into the support aspect, so again, just providing that assistance, resources, and infrastructure to communities, really addressing historical injustices if they do come up, and recognizing that past and present social and economic disparities contribute to climate vulnerability and contribute to failed programs within LMI communities. And then finally, making sure that promotion of access to clean energy and technology is so imperative. So making sure that this information, these initiatives, not only are LMI households at the table and they're involved in this, and vice versa, you're involved in their community, but also making sure that the promotion of these materials and these ideas is accessible and just easy for LMI communities to reach. Research shows that often low to middle income communities have the least access to energy efficiency and clean energy technology. Simply just the cost to upgrade to energy efficiency is really burdensome to these communities. An example of this was a study that came out of Yale, and light bulbs, like energy efficient light bulbs, are twice as expensive in low to middle income communities versus more affluent communities, which really shows the disparity that we're seeing. And for most of the stores that are in these low income communities, they don't even carry energy efficient bulbs, simply because there's not a market for it, because it's too expensive for these communities. So again, just making sure that you're building trust, keeping costs low, making sure that things are accessible, and acknowledging these historical injustices is and ensuring that all of this is really baked into the initiatives that we're hoping to move towards is really exciting, and something that needs to be at the forefront of everything that we're working on. Finally, there are things and programs that are running right now that are taking steps in the right direction and are doing all of these things incredibly. One of them that we really wanted to highlight was Justice in 100. So this is their score sheet. Basically, you can go to their website, Justice in 100, and they give you a score sheet like this, and whatever program on the state, federal, local, et cetera level, you can go ahead and score them based on things like process, restoration, decision-making, et cetera. And you can give them a score out of 100, just to kind of be critical in the way that we're thinking about how legislation is moving through, who's being involved, and how effective these programs are really going to be. So to wrap up, I kind of just want to talk about the future of things and how we can use this information moving forward. Really and truly, we just want to make sure that there's an improvement of energy access and affordability, so that it helps with things like procedural justice, economic participation, and community ownership. Additionally, we want to ensure that health and environmental impacts for all are lessened, and in making sure that equity is kind of baked and the main focus of our programs and initiatives that we have moving forward, we can ensure all of these things become a little bit more healed. Additionally, it's really important that we have strict definitions of what renewable energies are, and so that everyone can be on the same page about those things. But more specifically, being really making sure that we understand and that we are well educated on our own part about the communities that we're trying to serve. Marginalized communities should always be included in stakeholder engagement, and they should always kind of be at the forefront of our minds, and not just, we tend to throw terms around like equity, environmental justice, et cetera, a lot, but getting to know these communities on a firsthand basis is difficult, but doing some of that legwork and doing some of that upfront work is very necessary. You can't heal a wound if you've never met your patient and you've never properly assessed them. And so it's really important that we continue to apply those things to the programs and institutions that we want to create moving forward. Nothing is going to be perfect at first, obviously, but it's again imperative that we just really center equity and inclusion, and that overall, equity in the context of the climate crisis is essential to ensure that the burden of combating climate change is shared fairly, and that all communities, regardless of your income, regardless of your background, have equal opportunities to adapt, to thrive, and to contribute to the sustainability and resilience efforts, and are able to move us all towards a cleaner grid.
Great, thank you, Lilith. And John, I believe you have our last slides for today. Oh, you're muted, John.
Thank you. And I really want to thank our previous speakers who I think we did a great job at selecting speakers for this. It's a new topic, and I think a lot of us don't know that much about it, including me. So I've really enjoyed just listening to it. By chance, I'm up here in Vermont. I was on a biomass tour, so I was able to think about this and learn about this a lot going through small communities in Vermont this week. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about considerations of wooden chips in terms of equity.
Oh, John, you're on mute again.
Thanks. Actually, I do want to say, Alliance for Green Heat, we are almost agnostic on how you decarbonize your heat. We are specialists in wood and pellet systems, but whether you decarbonize through a heat pump or any other way is great. And I think, as Jared said, we need to meet people where they are, get people to do it as quick as possible, however they can afford to do it. And historically, it's interesting. If you talk to your grandparents and great grandparents, if they're alive, or parents, we've gone through an incredible transition from wood to coal to oil to gas to electricity and renewables. And traditionally, it is the richer households that do it first, and so the poorer households are one or two fuels behind. And so we don't have a great track record at going through energy transitions. And as we go through this energy transition, hopefully we'll do better. But the things that make energy transitions to renewables more difficult is higher install costs. As we all know, heat pumps are very expensive to install. You can end up with more centralized production and more centralized control by big multinational companies. States that have high electricity prices are at a disadvantage, especially when it comes to heat pumps. And we still live in a society where fossil fuel companies are very powerful and very well funded. But I think the planning, things that make this transition better than in the past is that we do have a lot of policies and laws and regulations, such as clean heat standards themselves, which really do look at equity and account for it. Okay, so what's the goal of a transition to renewable energy. So under a clean heat standard, a lot of people think, well, what should be the outcome? Should you have more pellet stoves, fewer wood stoves, phase out wood and replace it with heat pumps? And I think in some ways, these questions are almost premature, but they're so easy for us to want to jump to. I think first we have to really look at how do we get there and who decides? And do we rely on expertise of urban policymakers, or do we really just work with towns and counties, or do we work with individual homeowners? So when you talk about stakeholders and how low-income stakeholders are at the table, it's actually very complicated, and it's easy. I think it's easy for more educated policymakers to jump to conclusions. And one thing we didn't get to hear from Jared, and maybe Jared, you could talk to this in the questions, is how did you get the right stakeholders at the table? Do you think you had the right stakeholders at the table? And what stakeholders, how much control, for instance, or influence do low-income stakeholders have moving forward in your plan? Okay, and then, so as Lilith mentioned, this Justice in 100, it's a fabulous report. I recommend it to everybody. It does a really good analysis of the first 10 state laws that are shooting for 100% renewable energy. But as I read through it, I saw that that group has already decided on a definition of renewable energy. And as you can see in number 8, this group says that gas power plants, renewable natural gas, carbon capture, biofuels, biomass, waste energy, waste heat, those are not allowed. So they've already kind of decided what renewable energy should be in the future of plans. I think that's really problematic because, especially with wood heat, we have in rural areas, a lot of low-income people heat with wood. They've chosen wood not necessarily because they want to use it, but it's because that's all they can afford. So how do you, figure out who decides on how those people should heat in the future? So this is a map of where wood heating is most prominent. So this will kind of show you what states are going to have to grapple with wood heat in their clean heat standards. I mean, every state will, but it's really, the Northeast and the West, actually Missouri, Arkansas, Virginia, West Virginia. These are the states that are going to really have to figure out how wood heating fits in their clean heat standard. And when you think about stakeholders, who is at the table and how equity is addressed in a clean heat standard, I guess ultimately it's up to the legislature. It's ultimately up to the legislature in Vermont to vote on theirs, in Massachusetts. So these are both very liberal states. I think when hopefully conservative states will be developing clean heat standards, and equity may be addressed in very different ways, or may be not addressed very well, depending on the values of the legislature and what they end up voting on. So if you think about equity in rural areas that rely on wood heat, it's really a balance of funding, equity, carbon reductions. There's a lot of goals in this transition. And it's not just carbon. You also want clean air. You want clean water. You want, there's a lot of things that we want out of this transition. And I think sometimes we have to accept that equity and renewable energy goals can collide, especially when there's not enough funding to address them, and there's rarely enough funding. An obvious solution is resorting to more reliance on heating assistance. That's an obvious solution, but it's not an ideal one. Wood heating, especially wood stoves, are not ideal at all because they have serious, smoke. And there was a question in the was asked about, what is modern wood heat or advanced wood heat? I think generally it does not include wood stoves, but it does include everything that's automated. And Chris, I have to admit, I'm kind of shocked that pellet stoves are not considered advanced wood heating in Massachusetts. To me, that means that decision was not made with equity in mind, because the systems that you showed, those are $20,000, $30,000 systems. A pellet stove is $3,000, $4,000 and heavily used by middle income and lower income people to save money on their heating bill. Okay, and then another thing about equity is jobs. So what energy you use in a state will determine how much that money stays in the state, and even how much money stays in your immediate community. And that's one thing about wood, as you can see in the lower right. 80% of this is in Vermont, but I think this is similar for most states. That money stays in the community. It stays, it helps with, jobs for rural folks. And you see also electricity. A lot of the money can stay in the state, because that's assuming your electricity is generated in the state, which most states make their own electricity. I know Vermont does import a lot of renewable electricity from Quebec. But then once you get to liquid fossil fuels, you can see that's where your money flows out of the states, and it really flows out of low-income communities. So those low-income communities probably suffer the worst from their dollars leaving their community. Now, I want to get back to Vermont. I'm up here in Vermont, and has really been inspired by what I see. And this is, Jared already covered this. So you can see in Vermont, when they mix equity, affordability, and carbon, they have to mix all these values together. And what they came up with is massive expansion of heat pumps, so 200,000 heat pumps.
John, I just want to hop in to let you know about your minute mark being reached.
Okay, thank you, Darian. 50,000 pellet stoves. So basically they have not one or the other, but all of the above. Now, Jared already showed this. This is his slide, but I do just want to make the point that when you talk about equity, it's not just about households, it's about schools, it's about institutions. They're poor communities where that have to heat their buildings. And a poor college that we visited here in Vermont, they don't have an endowment, like the big fancy colleges. And so when you think about equity, you really have to think about institutions and communities, not just households. And that's it. So thank you very much. I hope you guys have a lot of questions. And I'd ask our speakers to turn on your cameras, and we can. Darren, do you want to ask some questions?
Yeah, sure. We do have one more poll to launch. After all of this, kind of the big question that we want to know from y'all, should the clean heat standards include chip and pellets as an eligible renewable option? We do know from multiple speakers talking about, well, what actually qualifies as automated wood heating or advanced wood heating. This is so different. I think still up for discussion, but we'll leave this open for a few seconds. I guess as this rolls, we can go into some questions. First off, some people asked about if slides will be shared. Yes, they will. A recording and everyone's slides will be shared tomorrow in a follow-up email. And if anyone needs verification for continuing education credits, email me. I'll have my email at the end. But for those, if they need to drop off, it's Darian@forgreenheat.org. I'll put that in the chat as well. And I can get that to you. Let's see. So for our poll, we've got a pretty happy crowd with the topic today. but with still some holdouts, which, we need. We need those holdouts to have a good conversation. So that's nice to see. First off, so we have someone asking about clean heat standards for New Hampshire, and this came up, the timing looks like during Jared's talk, but does anyone have any kind of like leads or any indications of other states that are coming up with clean heat standards? And is New Hampshire one of those?
I'm not aware of movement in New Hampshire to explore or adopt a clean heat standard. If that's happening, I would love to hear about it. It would be a positive development, but that's not something I'm aware of.
All right. Sorry, Mila. We don't have any leads for you, but hopefully that's coming up. Let's see. And so Jonathan is talking about how we can clarify the underpinning of a clean heat standard. So what its actual goal is, the use of clean, how do we kind of present that to stakeholders? Does anyone have any good answers for that?
I think what John's getting at is clean is referring to decarbonization. So treating CO2 as the pollutant, as it were. So that's the goal of these standards, is to reduce the carbon emissions of heating. And so that's what we mean. Now, I think when it comes to wood, sometimes people say, well, that's not clean because it has emissions, and so that's sort of a different spin on it. Clean heat is decarbonizing. Low carbon heat is sort of the way this is laid out.
Yeah, I would agree with Chris about that. Just one kind of friendly minor amendment is that at least in Vermont's clean heat standard, and I imagine in the others that will be developed, the measure is really greenhouse gas emissions. So not just carbon dioxide, but also methane and nitrous oxide, measured in a CO2 equivalent formula, which becomes really important for, especially methane on the fossil gas side. So I know that oftentimes carbon emissions and CO2 equivalent or greenhouse gas emissions are used interchangeably, but I think it is valuable to just pause and say it's really life cycle greenhouse gas emissions is the underlying measure when we're talking about the complying with the performance standard. There are other pieces, at least in the Vermont law, I don't know if they're being contemplated elsewhere, that talk about sustainable sourcing and environmental review and monitoring for any potential adverse health impacts and quantifying some of the health benefits that are likely to emerge, so that there are eyes on factors other than reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because while that is an incredibly important metric, it's certainly not the only metric, but that's the metric that is at the base of how clean heat credits are measured. And then there's the second fundamental metric, which is about who's being served, and the requirement to have most of the clean heat services being provided to low and moderate income households.
I just like that. I think it is important to consider PM, particulate matter. I think that's why advanced wood heat, that I think a lot of clean heat standards may refer to, would not include the traditional cordwood stove, because while it may have an excellent carbon footprint, it simply does put too much, usually puts too much particulates in the air, assuming that you have neighbors, assuming that you're not living in the middle of nowhere, which some people do, and those are the places where wood stoves are the most appropriate. But as Lilith alluded to, a lot of what we're also trying to get away from is where you put larger energy installations, and traditionally those have been in low income neighborhoods, and when we talk about energy justice, we're talking about making sure that when you're deciding where things go, that they shouldn't necessarily go right next to the most vulnerable poor neighborhood that has the least ability to advocate for itself and try to avoid being the breathing all that stuff.
And another big question that came up, and Chris answered one of them already, typed out an answer, but someone else kind of made a comment saying that while residential pellet boilers are very expensive, surely out of the reach of a lot of homes, that they do also, they are whole home systems. So they're also doing home water. And Jonathan has in here the 25% of a home's energy use often comes from heating hot water. So it's something to consider, like, yeah, that's super expensive, but they're doing a lot more than just providing you some space heating. That's great. Let's see, David, thoughts on how we can reconcile between greenhouse gas reductions and criteria pollutants and wood heat versus gas or kitchen table decisions? Does anyone want to take a crack at that? If not, you guys can sit and ruminate with it and type an answer. I'll leave it.
David is talking criteria pollutants. I think he is talking about more, PM. That's just kind of what we were talking about a little bit, is how do you balance reducing carbon with reducing unhealthful particulates? Is that Jared, is that what you make of that question?
Yeah, and I want to note that the considerations are very different state by state, depending on kind of population density, kind of whether states are in attainment or not, what the air quality monitoring is like. Here in Vermont, it's a pretty rural state. There are certainly some river valleys, especially places that experience temperature inversions where there are kind of PM concerns at certain points in the winter. I do know that there's a real hope here that, we get 25% of our heating in Vermont from wood heat already, and that's primarily from old wood stoves. And so we really think that there is an ability to change out those older wood stoves. We have a wood stove changeout program through the Clean Energy Development Fund here. Efficiency Vermont, our statewide efficiency utility, also provides incentives for stove changeouts. And so, the modeling shows that there really is an ability to increase the amount of heating that we're getting from wood while reducing particulate emissions by changing out and helping people move away from older, less efficient wood stoves and installing more efficient, whether automated or just more efficient modern pellet and wood stoves that meet stricter emissions requirements. But that is always something that needs to be monitored via local air quality, and because those are both incredibly important things to be achieving, is not just greenhouse gas emissions reduction, but also monitoring of human health and making sure we're not creating hotspots of PM pollution.
Yeah, I just add, Massachusetts, unfortunately, DEP partnered with the Mass Clean Energy Center on a wood stove changeout program, and funding ran out for that several years ago. I get literally weekly calls from people asking about it. There are some federal tax incentives, but I think that's a critical piece. I think some regulators in Massachusetts are projecting that wood stove installations will increase here as backups to heat pumps, and so we want to make sure that we're doing that with the cleanest possible systems, and that we're changing out the ones that are really old and have the highest impact on air quality.
Great. And then related, we're really life cycle of greenhouse gases. Someone asked, does anyone know what the life cycle of greenhouse gases for just leaving trees to decompose naturally? And they asked, are we actually minimizing the harm from methane of the wood decomposing by burning it? A huge question. I know we'll have webinars in the future about this even. Does anyone want to take a crack at
it? Forest carbon is very complicated. I'm not sure that you would be, it's better to remove decaying wood for a lot of reasons. There's wildlife purposes, there's soil carbon purposes, and leaving coarse woody debris and decaying wood in the forest. I think that where this question comes into play is with wood waste. So particularly tree service and tree service company chips created by your local DPW, taking down street trees or trees around parks or playgrounds. Oftentimes for towns, that ends up in a giant pile, and it gets left there for like a year. And so that's when you start really getting methane generation, is when you chip wood and you pile it up and you leave it for the long term. So that's where using some of that that wood can make a carbon difference. It makes, because it's going to release this carbon into the atmosphere, and potentially it can release methane, which is a more potent, greenhouse gas. So that's where there's some opportunity. In Massachusetts, we have, the estimate is 3.8 million tons of that material is created every year. So that's a huge amount. And in Massachusetts, it's actually illegal to landfill that. So it's often getting transported other places to landfill, or it's being left to rot and potentially release methane. So that there's questions around that issue that we've been exploring.
Great. Someone else asks, have y'all ever seen masonry heaters be able to fulfill a clean heat standard in definition of advanced wood heating?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I think they're very interesting, and it's kind of a long time proven technology, but it's kind of in a regulatory gray area. I'm not sure there's really been much attention paid to it at that level. I
know John is a big fan of masonry heaters. No comment, John.
Yeah, no, they, in fact, these are, for most people, I'm sure on this webinar know what they are, but they're massive masonry heaters. They often cost $20,000 also to install. They can last for generations. In Europe, you still find ones that are hundreds of years old and working quite well, and they generally put out about the same PM per BTU as a pellet stove because of how they work. So, I think the more people that have them, just like with pellet stoves, the better. But I don't think we'll ever see too much uptake because they're so expensive. But I'm sure in Vermont there's, I don't know, 300, 400, 500 of them around, and you probably never see any visible smoke from them.
Yeah, they burn so hot and fast that they burn very, very clean, and they've got these channels that the smoke goes through, and all the heat is absorbed into the masonry and then slowly released into the house. So it requires no electricity, and you can heat your house with a single burn for 12 to 24 hours. So there's a lot of advantages to them. Really interesting.
Jared, can I ask you, how did you engage low-income stakeholders in your process? And do you think it was effective? And is there an ongoing plan to do that you think is effective?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes directly from the Global Warming Solutions Act that passed in Vermont, that created the Vermont Climate Council, 23 members. And one of the things that the law required was a diversity of representation among the council itself. One of the appointed councilors is a representative of the community action agencies across Vermont, the anti-poverty institutions that serve lower income Vermonters. There are also other appointed seats of folks to represent rural communities or youth voice, et cetera. So part of it is in the composition of the council, but then it was also very importantly in the public process that the council went through in terms of developing the climate action plan, public meetings in person and online in all areas of the state, public polling, focus groups. I think that we always need to be doing more and trying harder and meeting people where they're at. But I think that there are some really strong elements just baked into the Global Warming Solutions Act in terms of how our council is composed and the public process requirements that aren't just kind of like show up at a public hearing and be able to make a comment, but we're, meeting at state parks and in downtowns for table conversations in ways that were more accessible than perhaps a traditional. But I think we're all also still trying to learn and improve. This isn't something that we can just kind of check the box and say we're done. We always need to be trying to do more and do better in terms of in this space.
Chris, can I ask you, have you seen so far in Massachusetts, are they, do you think they have a good stakeholder representation? And when you look at the rural poor and the urban poor, they're very different issues and solutions. And so just to me, it seems like that balance is going to be challenging, but seems like in Vermont, it went pretty well.
Yeah, I think in Massachusetts, you're right, John. This is something we're constantly pushing back on. Is there's not a lot of attention paid to the rural parts of the state. I used to run a summer camp in the Berkshires. I would tell people I'm heading out to the Berkshires. It was like going to the other side of the moon. But people would think nothing about driving 2 hours onto the Cape with traffic or something. So it's strange, but yeah, I think there's been tremendous recognition of equity and so forth in this, but it often underrepresents the rural poor, and that's not something a lot of people are thinking about in Massachusetts, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think we have time for question and kind of we actually just got one more into the Q&A. Let's see. All right, we'll handle that one later. That one's a little bit more complicated technically. But I did have a question, Lilith, when you came on here, there hasn't been a lot of questions about equity. Any other kind of like, other than the ones John has brought up here, was there like a question you were just hoping, you were begging the audience to ask so that other people could answer, you yourself could answer? Do you have one?
Not necessarily. I like to think that the lack of questions regarding equity means that these are conversations that we're already having, which, that's the hope. But I really just wanted to drive home the point with the presentation that I gave that, yeah, equity and intersection in making sure that when we're creating these initiatives is really important. It needs to be the first thing that we're focusing on, because if not, people are going to get left behind. And that's a fact. We're already seeing it now, and it's only going to continue to worsen if we don't continue to put these things at the forefront. And so programs that like the Vermont Clean Heat Act and the Massachusetts Clean Heat Standards that we're seeing are fantastic steps in the right direction. And I think that there's a lot that we can learn that will, like, as I mentioned, these programs are not perfect. They're never going to be, but there's a lot that we can learn from these programs. And it's imperative that we continue to center these issues.
Does anyone have any last comments? We'll slowly kind of wrap it up. If not, great. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Jared, Chris, Phyllis, John. It's been great. I'm going to throw up a last kind of like little screen with everyone's emails so that everyone can get that figured out. Let me see here. There we go. So any other questions, send them our way or someone's way. We will listen and we will answer.
And Darian, our next webinar is going to be on carbon and accounting. We're going to co-host that with the Northern Forest Center. The registration is not ready, but it's going to be on January 17th. And so everyone on this webinar will get a notice about that, and hope you can join us for that.
Yeah, and as everyone leaves, I'll have one or poll question. We've got a lot dropping off, so it's all right. You can answer it real quick before you click end. And a reminder that we'll have this recording out to you all tomorrow in a follow-up email. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Darian. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody.